Usually when we talk about a moral failing, there's this comforting expectation of universal agreement.
Right, like we all basically agree on the big stuff.
Exactly. Take theft, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, you steal someone's wallet on the street, society points to the legal code, we look at the harm caused, and we all just collectively nod and say, yep, that is undeniably wrong.
Broken or not broken, the moral compass points true north.
Yeah, it's clean. It's binary.
But when you step into the world of animal rights and human utility, that moral compass starts spinning wildly. You find yourself in an ethical landscape that is just incredibly murky.
Oh, for sure.
Just to give you an idea of how contradictory human behavior can be in this space, think about Higgins, Pennsylvania. For decades, right up until 1998, this town held an annual Labor Day festival.
Okay, what kind of festival?
Well, it was a live animal shooting event. They would release thousands of pigeons from traps, just one by one, for contestants to shoot.
Wait, and people would actually travel to watch this? Like as a spectator sport?
Thousands of spectators. I mean, they would sit in bleachers, eat, drink beer, and just cheer.
Wow.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the really visceral, genuinely difficult part to visualize is what happened between the rounds, because most of the birds weren't killed instantly. They were, just wounded.
Oh, no.
So the festival organizers actually sent young children out onto the field to collect the injured birds.
You're kidding. Kids.
Kids! And these kids would stomp on them and rip their heads off or toss them into barrels to just suffocate under the weight of other dying pigeons.
That's just horrifying.
It really is.
And yet, if you describe that exact scene to almost anyone today, they would instantly recoil. They would instinctively agree that this specific act of cruelty is just wrong.
Without a doubt.
But that brings us to the real question. Like, the whole reason we're here today, why exactly is it wrong?
Right, the underlying why.
Because the answer to that why changes entirely depending on which philosophical framework you apply. Today is Monday, May 4, 2026, and we are stepping right into those muddy waters.
We really are.
We're doing a deep dive today using David de Gracia's foundational book, Animal Rights, a very short introduction. And the mission here is to build you a rock-solid philosophical toolkit.
Exactly. Because whether you are an undergrad prepping for a high-stakes class debate or you're just an intellectually curious learner, we want you to understand the underlying logic driving the arguments about human utility versus animal welfare.
Right, because before you can effectively debate modern animal rights, you really have to understand the historical baggage that sits underneath our assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. We do not just wake up believing human utility automatically trumps animal welfare. I mean, that is a learned, inherited hierarchy.
So where does that inheritance start? Like, why is our default setting so heavily skewed toward human supremacy?
Well, in the Western tradition, you can trace the foundation of that hierarchy straight back to Aristotle.
Oh, okay. Going way back.
Way back. He was incredibly influential in categorizing the natural world. Aristotle argued that animals possess sense perception, so they can see, hear, and feel, but they fundamentally lack reason.
Right.
And in his framework, the universe was ordered by purpose. Because animals lacked rationality, he believed their natural biological purpose was simply to serve as resources for humans, because we do possess reason.
So rationality was the ultimate currency. If you don't have it, you're basically just biological raw material.
That's the idea, yeah.
But it gets even more extreme later on, doesn't it? Because I recall reading about René Descartes in the 17th century, and, his view seems almost incomprehensible today.
Yeah, Descartes took Aristotle's hierarchy and applied 17th century physics to it. He basically viewed the entire natural world mechanically, like a giant clockwork system.
Little machines.
Literally. He concluded that animals were merely organic machines. He believed the human mind, the rational soul, was a unique immaterial thing, and the physical body was just mechanics.
Okay.
So since he didn't grant animals a rational soul, he deduced they couldn't have consciousness. Therefore, they could not actually feel pain.
Wait, so Descartes literally thought a dog crying out in pain was no different than like a broken toaster making a grinding noise, just a squeaking gear in a machine.
That is precisely how he viewed it. The yelp of a dog was just the sound of air escaping a mechanical valve.
That feels so completely counterintuitive to anyone who has ever spent 5 minutes with a pet. You step on a dog's tail, it yelps, it cowers, it avoids you. How did an entire intellectual tradition build itself on ignoring something so painfully obvious?
What's fascinating here is that this mechanical blindness wasn't a universal human default.
Mhm.
If we look globally, Eastern traditions did not assume human supremacy in that same absolute, rigid way.
Oh, really? So they had a different baseline entirely.
Completely different. Jainism and Buddhism, for instance, are driven by ahimsa. That's the principle of non-injury to all living things.
Right. Nonviolence.
Exactly. Their worldview is rooted in reincarnation, which creates a really profound sense of the interconnectedness of all life. You aren't fundamentally separated from the animal by some magical wall of rationality. You're part of the exact same cycle.
And Hinduism shares a similar interconnectedness too, right? Though often tying it to self-interest, like harming life now brings you suffering later down the karmic road.
Yeah, the karmic consequences.
So in the East, you have this baseline of interconnectedness, while the West is operating on a baseline of rigid mechanical hierarchy. What actually forced the West to start cracking that foundation? Because if Descartes was the gold standard, it seems impossible that anyone would suddenly pivot.
Two massive paradigm shifts eventually dismantled that foundation. First, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, Darwin fundamentally proved that the differences between humans and other animals are a matter of degree, not of kind. I mean, we evolved from common ancestors, we share nervous systems.
Right, so that sudden cutoff where pain magically stops existing is scientifically impossible to defend.
Exactly. And the second shift came from the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He essentially looked at the Aristotle framework and said, we are measuring the wrong thing entirely. Bentham argued that the moral question isn't, can they reason, or can they talk? The only morally relevant question is, can they suffer?
Can they suffer? Wow, that single question completely changes the architecture of the debate
It flips it on its head.
because you don't need to pass a math test to feel a burn.
Precisely.
And that brings us perfectly to the core definitions. If you're going into a classroom debate, you need to know exactly how to categorize what we owe to animals. The source material outlines 3 distinct tiers of rights.
Yeah, let's break those down.
Tier 1 is what philosophers call moral status.
Yes, moral status is the absolute baseline. If a being has moral status, it means its welfare matters for its own sake, independently of how it affects humans.
Okay, so it has value in and of itself.
Right. We can understand this better by contrasting it with the older, traditional, indirect duty view. That older view suggests that kicking a dog is wrong only because it damages someone else's property, or maybe because practicing cruelty makes the kicker a more violent person who might eventually hurt a human.
So the concern is still entirely human-centric.
Exactly. But true moral status means kicking a dog is wrong simply because it needlessly harms the dog. The dog's pain matters.
Okay, so moral status gets you on the board. Tier 2 is equal consideration, and this one is significantly stricter.
It is.
It dictates that we must give equal moral weight to comparable interests. So, if a human has an interest in avoiding physical pain, and a cow has an interest in avoiding physical pain, those 2 specific interests are morally equal. We cannot discount the cow's pain just because it's a cow.
And then we reach Tier 3, which is utility trumping rights. This is the strictest, most protective tier. It means that vital interests, such as the absolute right to life or liberty, are protected no matter what.
Like absolute untouchable rights.
Yes. You cannot violate those rights, even if doing so would massively benefit society as a whole.
Let me try to synthesize this for you with an analogy. Think of it like trying to get into an incredibly exclusive nightclub.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Tier 1, moral status, means you are on the guest list. You are recognized. You get through the door.
You're in the building.
Right. Tier 2, equal consideration, means once you're inside the club, you get the exact same drink prices as the VIPs. You're treated equally in the areas where you both participate.
Makes sense.
But Tier 3, utility trumping rights, means nobody can kick you out of the club. Even if 100 people are waiting in line outside and kicking you out would make the crowd immensely happy, you have an absolute right to be there.
That's a great way to put it.
But wait, I need to push back on Tier 2.
Yeah.
Because if I argue for equal consideration in a debate, does my opponent get to say, oh, so you think we have to give pigs the right to vote?
They might try that, but that represents a complete misunderstanding of the concept. Equal consideration only applies to comparable interests.
Ah, comparable.
Right. Pigs do not have the cognitive capacity to understand governance, so they have no interest in reading, driving, or voting. Those rights simply don't apply.
That makes total sense.
However, both humans and pigs do possess a nervous system. Both have a profound interest in avoiding physical suffering. So, regarding that specific shared interest, equal consideration demands we treat the pig's suffering as equally important to human suffering.
Okay, so armed with this toolkit, moral status, equal consideration, and utility trumping rights, we have to anticipate the counterarguments. If I bring equal consideration to a debate, the opposition isn't just going to fold.
Definitely not. They are going to vigorously defend human superiority.
And from what I read in the source, their biggest philosophical weapon is contract theory. How exactly does that work?
Contract theory operates on the idea that rights are a human invention born from mutual agreement. It argues that rights only belong to moral agents, beings who can understand a social contract and carry reciprocal obligations.
So in exchange.
Exactly. The logic is, I respect your property, you respect mine, and we both agree to the laws governing that respect. Because animals cannot comprehend laws, sign a social contract, or be held morally accountable for their actions, they fall completely outside the sphere of moral rights.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because the moment you apply that logic universally, it completely falls apart.
It hits a wall pretty fast.
Yeah. What about humans who don't fit that paradigm? What about human infants? Or humans with severe cognitive disabilities? An infant cannot sign a contract. They don't carry moral obligations.
They definitely don't.
So if the strict rule is no contract, no rights, does contract theory mean we are philosophically justified in experimenting on human babies?
That is an excellent, devastating pushback, and it's the exact logical hole that philosophers like Peter Carruthers have tried desperately to patch.
How do you even patch that?
Well, Carruthers attempts to save contract theory by using a slippery slope argument. He essentially claims that if we don't grant rights to infants, society's overall respect for human life might erode.
So it's about protecting the system.
Right. He argues we might accidentally start abusing rational adults because our ability to judge who is and isn't rational is imperfect. Alternatively, he uses an appeal to social stability. He argues that rational adults care deeply about infants, so society would be too emotionally distressed if we harmed them.
That feels incredibly fragile. The argument is essentially that the only reason we shouldn't harm an infant is because it might make adults sad or make society messy, not because the infant itself inherently matters.
That is the unavoidable conclusion of strict contract theory. Those patches are intellectually flimsy compared to the much simpler, more elegant explanation, which is that sentient beings simply have moral status.
Right.
Their suffering matters intrinsically, regardless of their ability to sign a contract. Because contract theory struggles so heavily with the infant problem, most opponents of animal rights eventually abandon it entirely.
And what do they fall back on?
A different model entirely, the sliding scale model.
Ah, the sliding scale model. This is where you acknowledge that animals matter, but you posit that humans sit at the very top and deserve full consideration. The animals get varying lower levels of consideration based on their cognitive, emotional, and social complexity.
Precisely.
So, a chimpanzee's suffering matters quite a bit, a mouse's matters less, and a chicken's matters even less.
It is arguably the most common intuitive alternative to equal consideration. It allows people to recognize animal suffering without surrendering human privilege.
So, how do these abstract theories hold up when we drag them out of the classroom and force them to collide with human appetite? Let's take our toolkit and apply it to the ethics of factory farming. Our source material does not shy away from the grim reality of this industry.
No, it is quite explicit. Let's look at the textbook examples provided in the book. Consider Hen X. She lives her entire life in a wire battery cage. It is so densely packed, she cannot physically stretch her wings.
Oh, that's awful.
And it gets worse. To prevent the birds from pecking each other to death out of pure, confined stress, her beak is sliced off through highly sensitive tissue without any anesthesia.
And then there's Hog Y from the source. After being weaned, he is kept in a slatted finish pen, completely isolated by iron bars, which is psychological torture for a highly social, intelligent animal.
Completely isolating them.
Right. And his tail is docked without anesthesia. And at the slaughterhouse, if he resists the stunner out of sheer terror, workers beat him with iron pipes to force him onto the conveyor belt.
It's brutal.
So let's apply our frameworks. If you bring equal consideration to this reality, factory farming is completely unequivocally indefensible, right?
Absolutely. If human suffering and animal suffering are weighed equally, then the sheer scale of institutionalized torment in factory farming cannot be justified.
Because it's not a necessity.
Exactly. Because the vast majority of humans do not need meat to survive. It is a choice made primarily for culinary pleasure and convenience. Equal consideration dictates that you cannot inflict massive, severe, lifelong suffering on billions of beings merely to satisfy a minor human preference for taste.
But what if my debate opponent leans on the sliding scale model? They argue, well, sure, big suffering matters, but human pleasure matters more because we're infinitely more cognitively complex. Like we built skyscrapers, they roll in mud.
Even if we accept the sliding scale model, where human interests inherently way heavier than animal interests, factory farming still fails the ethical
Oh,
test
so?
because you have to weigh the specific interests at play. On one side, you have a relatively minor human interest, the fleeting pleasure of eating a bacon cheeseburger instead of a plant-based meal. On the other side, you have the severe, lifelong, unremitting agony of hog Y.
Right.
Even on a sliding scale, a minor preference for convenience cannot possibly outweigh absolute total suffering. The mathematical balance of harm versus benefit still collapses entirely.
When the philosophical defenses fall, the opponent's absolute last resort will always be economics. They'll argue that factory farming is an economic necessity. It provides artificially cheap food, it sustains massive industries, it provides jobs. How do we counter the economic necessity argument?
You counter it by exposing the hidden costs, because the cheap food argument is a massive illusion. The source highlights that eliminating factory farming actually removes catastrophic environmental damage. We are talking about massive deforestation to grow feed crops and severe water pollution from billions of gallons of untreated manure.
Wow, yeah, those are huge costs.
And it removes severe public health risks, specifically the looming threat of antibiotic resistance caused by pumping livestock full of drugs just to keep them alive in filthy conditions.
Not to mention the pure inefficiency of it.
Exactly. The source points out the incredibly inefficient use of grain proteins. It takes roughly 21 pounds of grain protein fed to a cow to yield just 1 single pound of beef protein for human consumption.
That is just wild math.
We are actively wasting global food resources to sustain this model. Furthermore, we recognize in literally every other aspect of society that moral limits must govern profit-seeking. I mean, we don't allow human slavery or child labor, even though they would technically reduce the cost of manufactured goods. Economics alone cannot justify atrocities.
So factory farming crumbles under both equal consideration and the sliding scale, because the human benefit boils down to mere pleasure and artificial cheapness.
Right.
But what happens when the stakes are legitimately life and death? Let's move to our second application, biomedical animal research. This is the ultimate final boss battleground for a class debate, because farming is for pleasure, but biomedical research involves human lives on the line.
And just like with farming, we have to ground the philosophy in the actual realities of the source material. The public often assumes all animal testing is for life-saving cancer drugs, but history shows a very different picture.
It really does.
Take the American Museum of Natural History's cat sex experiments. For 17 years, researchers actively mutilated cats. They surgically removed parts of their brains, destroyed their sense of smell, and severed nerves in their sex organs, purely to observe how these mutilations affected their sexual performance.
That's just bizarre.
There was no clear human benefit, no disease being cured. It was purely observational curiosity.
Or Harry Harlow's psychological experiments on infant monkeys. He designed what he literally called monster mothers, surrogate wire mothers that would unexpectedly eject high-pressure air or shoot out sharp brass spikes when the terrified baby monkeys tried to hug them for comfort.
It's hard to even hear about.
And he isolated them in wells of despair, which were vertical chambers specifically designed to induce severe, crushing clinical depression.
Yeah, these experiments highlight the darkest edge of scientific curiosity when it is completely unchecked by moral consideration. But to your point, we have to tackle the hardest question. What about research that does promise a life-saving cure for humanity?
Right. So what does this all mean when the math gets brutal? If a scientist tells me that painfully testing a new chemical on 100 mice will directly result in a cure for a type of cancer that kills 1 million humans, does the sheer volume of human survival make the math morally acceptable?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your answer will depend entirely on whether you are a utilitarian or a strong animal rights advocate.
Okay, break that down.
A utilitarian believes in equal consideration. So they do weigh the mice's suffering equally against human suffering, but their ultimate guiding principle is to maximize the overall societal benefit. So a utilitarian might reluctantly heavily agree to the mouse experiment if and only if it is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be the absolute only way to achieve the cure.
So the massive benefit to 1 million beings outweighs the severe harm to the 100.
Exactly. But a strong animal rights advocate operates on Tier 3, utility trumping rights. And their answer is a hard stop. It doesn't matter what the math is.
Really? Even for 1 million lives?
Yes. They argue that just as you wouldn't round up 100 non-consenting humans off the street and painfully experiment on them to cure 1 million others, you cannot violate the vital interests of the mice. The individual right to life and liberty inherently trumps the utility of the cure, no matter how many people it saves.
Precisely. And because this specific debate is so deeply entrenched and seemingly unresolvable, the ethical push in the scientific community right now is heavily focused on an alternative path. The 3 R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement.
I found this part of the source incredibly hopeful because it moves past the philosophical gridlock into real, practical progress. We are finally moving away from historically barbaric standards.
Yeah, like the LD50 test, where researchers would literally force-feed an animal a chemical like a new lipstick ingredient or shampoo until exactly 50% of the test group died from toxicity.
Or the Dre's test, where they dripped toxic substances directly into the eyes of conscious, immobilized rabbits to measure the burning.
Right, those tests are actively being phased out through the principle of replacement. Instead of using a rabbit's eye, scientists are now utilizing synthetic human skin products, like Coruscitex, which mimics human tissue reactions perfectly without any nervous system to feel pain. They are utilizing advanced human cell cultures in petri dishes.
And reduction focuses on using advanced statistical models and computer simulations to get the exact same robust data while using drastically fewer animals.
And refinement ensures that if animals absolutely must be used, their pain and distress are aggressively, heavily minimized with modern analgesics and better living conditions.
So we've traveled from Aristotle to synthetic skin.
We really have. Let's recap the toolkit we built today. If you are stepping into a debate, the way you justify treating an animal depends entirely on the underlying framework. Are they Descartes' broken toasters, just unfeeling organic machines?
Or are they beings on a sliding scale where their suffering matters but always inherently less than ours?
Or do they command equal consideration where a pig's pain is morally equal to your pain?
It represents a profound shift in perspective. Once you clearly define those terms for yourself, the actions required of you, what you buy, what you support, what you argue for, they all change drastically.
So the next time you are walking down the aisle at the grocery store and you see a shampoo bottle proudly proclaiming not tested on animals, or you walk past a massive, cheap display of factory-farmed meat, you aren't just reacting with a vague, undefined sense of unease. You now possess the exact philosophical vocabulary to articulate why it might be morally problematic.
You can spot the indirect duty view in a politician's speech, you can dismantle the social contract theory in a classroom, and you can weigh the mathematics of the sliding scale.
You have officially moved from gut intuition to structured, rigorous, ethical reasoning.
Absolutely.
But before we end this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly terrifying thought experiment to mull over on your own. We talked extensively about the sliding scale model. It is the most common way we justify our dominance over animals, leaning heavily on our superior intelligence, our rationality, and our complex cognitive abilities.
Right.
Well, what happens if a highly advanced extraterrestrial species visits Earth tomorrow?
This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. If these beings are infinitely smarter, infinitely more cognitively and socially complex than humanity,
Wouldn't our own philosophical framework, the very sliding scale we use to justify our factory farms, legally and morally justify those aliens putting us into battery cages?
Oh, wow.
If intelligence and rationality truly dictate moral worth, we might just find ourselves on the wrong end of an interstellar slaughterhouse conveyor belt, being bred and used for their biomedical research.
It forces us right back to the dust of the Huygens pigeon chute, doesn't it? If a vastly superior species looked down at us from the bleachers, would they see us as equals deserving of utility trumping rights? Or would they view our suffering with the exact same cheering indifference that the crowd showed those injured birds?
Something for you to mull over.